Welcome to the Scottish Land Commission's Conference on Land Connection 2021 and to this panel on natural capital and how it can deliver community benefit. My name is MacInnes. I'm one of the 6 Scottish Land Commissioners and I'm joining you from here in Applecross in the North West Highlands, and I'm going to be your chair for the next hour. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, including the chat and comments section. There was some information up about this recording process and what will happen when it's published on our YouTube channel as you came into the conference, into this event. But if you have any more questions, please get in touch with us on the information email address, which is going to be shared shortly. So what is this panel about? Well, the Scottish Government has made a clear commitment to respond to the climate emergency and has set ambitious net zero targets. And meeting these will require very significant changes to our land use, to our woodlands, to our peatlands, and in terms of better soil and carbon management overall. By virtue of our geography and nature, Scotland is well positioned to meet this challenge, and there is substantial public and private financial interest in supporting this. And as we've heard from the Minister and Hamish Trench this morning, the market has responded very rapidly to these opportunities. But this is not necessarily an entirely a good thing, because along with these opportunities come some risks. Because it's essential that making these changes to land ownership and use are done in a way which ensures that communities and local economies are sharing the benefits and not paying an unfair burden of the costs. In short, that this transition is just, which is another commitment of the Scottish Government. So the focus of this panel over the next hour is how we can ensure that this boom in natural capital relating to land can really deliver community benefit. What can we learn from historically, from other natural resource sectors, from practical experience on the ground, and also from the international context? And so I'm really delighted to be joined by 4 experts in this field to have this discussion this afternoon. Magnus Davidson, Jeremy Leggett, Shona Glenn, and Geoffrey Hatcher. But before we start our conversation, I've got a few housekeeping notes. So I'm being supported by Posey and Claire and Sarah behind the scenes in this webinar. So thank you all for your help so far. In terms of the format, each of our 4 panelists will give a 5-minute introduction, and then I will be chairing a conversation between all 5 of us before opening out into a Q&A session with all of you. We have to finish promptly at 2:30, so I'm going to ask everyone please to be succinct. Please ask questions directly to the panel using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen on the left-hand side. And please identify which panelists you want to ask the question to. But we also would like you to use the chat function, which is on the bottom of your screen towards the right-hand side, to respond to general points and also to connect with other participants. Finally, at the end of this event, a short survey will be sent to everyone, so please take some time to give us feedback on this panel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Magnus Davidson, who is a research associate with the University of the Highlands and Islands Environmental Research Institute in Thurso. A native of the Highlands, Magnus's work focuses on a vision for rural Scotland that works both for people and for nature. He's also director of Community Land Scotland. So Magnus, over to you.
Many thanks, Megan. I'll just get kicked right off and probably focus a bit more on the latter around community ownership here. So for communities to best benefit sustainably from natural capital, they should be in ownership of that natural capital itself. I say sustainably because we need to consider this ownership against the 4 pillars of sustainability: environment, economy, society, and culture, as natural capital is not only about economic return to communities. I'll use some examples from here in the far north to explore some of these themes. Here in Caithness and North Sutherland, we produce over 1,200% of the electricity we consume from large wind farms. Owned by multinationals, with ground leased from large landowners and estates, huge amounts of power are exported south for the benefit of users elsewhere. Consumers here pay the highest price per unit of electricity, with some of the highest rates of fuel poverty in the whole of Scotland. We have community benefit funds, which contribute at most £5,000 per megawatt of installed capacity per annum. Not all of them pay that. A recent report looking at community-owned wind turbines in Scotland found on average each megawatt of installed capacity provided £170,000 per annum. If we scaled that up across Caithness and North Sutherland, instead of seeing nominal community benefit of £2.5 million, we would see community benefit of £85 million, a significant increase. It's worth a reminder, and a useful one in the context of this discussion, that we don't actually see the £2.5 million here, as these payments are voluntary rather than compulsory. The nearest wind farm to my home here only pays £2,500 per megawatt. One of the reasons Caithness and North Sutherland has no community-owned energy producers is because Caithness and North Sutherland have no community-owned land. But the main point here is that communities can benefit significantly more with the ownership of natural capital. Europe's largest blanket bog and the best of its type in the world stretches across Caithness and Sutherland. There's 400,000 hectares of blanket bog, with around 200,000 now known as flow country. Encompassing the straths of Kildonan and Naver, this part of the world is no stranger to landscape scale intervention. In the 1980s, government tax incentives led deforestation on a grand scale in areas of flow. A battleground between developers and conservationists ensued. The understanding of the damage to important ecosystems was understood then, but what we know now is that this planting has had a significant impact, negative impact on the ability for the peatlands to retain the storage of thousands of years worth of carbon. Tax changes in remote parliaments can have significant impacts in our own home landscapes, not always for the better. Our lesson here is that we need to be extremely careful with landscape scale changes, of which tax incentives and markets are a strong catalyst. Because of the afforestation, an ENGO decided to start buying up land of conservation importance. With now well over 10,000 hectares, they're a significant landowner in the area. At this point, it's worth stating that when it comes to the land question, communities of interest, arguably ENGOs, are not on a level peg with geographic communities. In one recent example, this landowner mobilised its massive national membership base to object to renewable energy development on neighbouring land, which was strongly supported by the local community. So much so that the local community came out in protest at the ENGO campaign with the slogan, "We are the endangered species," against the backdrop of significant depopulation in the area. Community of interest landowners with environmental aims, especially narrow species-specific remits, do not equate to the holistic approach we see from geographic community owners. A recent report for Community Land Scotland finds that communities in control of their own land punch above their weight in response to the climate emergency, whilst doing it in a holistic way that strengthens the community at the same time. Fundamentally, in Scotland, we have an unjust land system. Due to an unregulated land market, it's increasingly been exploited by a spectrum of new green lairds. Be they corporate offsetters, the nepification of asset-rich but cash-poor minor aristocratic estates, or green trophy lairds who have replaced deer with rewilding on a grand scale. We have a long history of exploitation of the environment by larger landowners to the social and cultural detriment of local communities. We also have an increasing body of evidence that natural capital in the ownership of communities delivers significantly. Delivering benefit from natural capital should begin with increasing regulation in the land market and legislation and resources to significantly increase geographic community ownership of land. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit out of breath trying to get through that in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Magnus. That was brilliant. Thank you for keeping to under 5 minutes, and also for so early on reminding us that we mustn't reinvent the wheel, and there are really important historical lessons that can be learned in terms of thinking about how we deal with this current boom in natural resource related land questions. So next, I'm going to pass over to Jeremy Leggett, who is an award-winning energy technology entrepreneur, the founder of Solar Sentry and Solar Aid. He's also the founder and executive director of Bunloit Rewilding Limited, a startup which is enhancing carbon, growing biodiversity and accelerating the rural Green New Deal in Scottish estates. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Megan. I suppose another way to describe that CV is that I'm actually a climate campaigner masquerading as a green businessman. I've been a climate campaigner for a quarter of a century, and I'm passionate about doing something about that. So what am I doing? Let's get to that in a minute. But first of all, let me say there's no doubt in my mind that the best model for going forward with the land in Scotland is community ownership of land and operation of it. I don't contest that view. I would absolutely take that view were I a native born Scot as opposed to a migrant political refugee aspiring Scot. But you know, I'm an entrepreneur, and I have got lucky once in my career with a major climate campaign, which was setting up a solar company. And to cut a long story short, that ended up doing very well. It experienced exponential growth. It was capitalized by high net worth individuals and family offices and that sort of thing. And my thinking when I exited that, when it was sold to the company, was I'd love to try and do it again. And how do I do that? Well, I could set up another solar company, but we all know that we have to take carbon dioxide down out of the atmosphere, and we have to do it in a way that protects biodiversity, because biodiversity is melting down as fast as climate is as well. So I, rightly or wrongly, thought I'm going to go up to Scotland and I'm going to buy a couple of small estates and have a bash at really making a substantive contribution as a campaigner owning and operating these two estates. So there are two aspects to this. One is I'm a scientist by training. I started life 10 years as an earth scientist at Imperial College. So I know a bit about it. And, you know, I thought I could work with Scottish universities and centers of excellence and really, you know, contribute in the front lines to de-risk this exercise of natural capital and how to operate it. So that's the first thing we're doing. But if you're running a campaign, you want to scale a bit. And so my idea was to buy other estates, but not to do that myself, to do that with a mass ownership company, setting up a mass ownership company that local people could own shares in. And here I could maybe contribute not just with climate meltdown and biodiversity collapse, but also the Rural Green New Deal, employing local people. There are already 16 people employed at Bunloit, mostly Highlanders, and also find a way of connecting local people into the other thing that's going on that we discuss, that people discussed this morning, which is the insane rising price of land in Scotland, which something has got to be done about. And in the interim, before it's done, can we find a way that where people benefit not just from, as it were, the kind of taxation that you do through renewables schemes, which I'm well familiar with. Solar Century has always given away 5% of its profits for community schemes, actually solar schemes in Africa, not in the UK. But you know, that's just a transfer of capital off the P&L, if you like, to use the business jargon. The asset is growing incredibly in value. How do you plug local people into that? So our idea is a mass ownership company. We're calling it Highlands Rewilding Limited, with breathtaking originality. And it's just started life, and it will raise capital from outside investors, but in parallel, trying very hard to find a way to get as many community folk and regional investors in Scotland in to participate, not just from whatever success we may or may not have with the natural capital, but also to plug into the rising price of the land. So I accept this isn't a perfect solution. It's nothing close to full community ownership, but my contention is that, you know, as a small scale, somewhere in the middle, it's a lot better than vast tracts of Scotland being bought up by corporations or Emirati princes or whatever, who are inevitably going to be absentee, and in many cases maybe won't even be interested in working the land for natural capital and employing local people and providing homes for local people.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks again for sticking within the time. It's really great to have you on this panel and to hear a bit, and I hope a bit more later, about the kind of the practical realities about trying to deliver these community benefits from pieces of land that you are, you know, you're in control of, at least currently in control of and responsible for. So I wanted next to hand over to Shona Glenn, who is the head of policy and research at the Scottish Land Commission and is responsible, therefore, for leading our programme of research and policy on reforming land rights and also reforming land markets. Prior to joining the Scottish Land Commission, Shona was a consultant in the private sector, assessing economic impacts on a wide range of developments. So over to you, Shona.
Thanks, Megan. Can I actually just start by saying I'm really pleased actually to have the opportunity to be talking about this today. And I know that that's something that people often say at the start of sessions like this, but in this case, it's actually really true, because I think Scotland is standing at the cusp of something really exciting here that has the potential to be just as important to the future of this country as oil. And I think that's really exciting. So, and I think there's a number of people who've signed up for this session today is anything to go by. I think a lot of other people see that too. So genuinely, I'm really excited to be here and to be part of that discussion. But climate mitigation, it's become big business in the last few years. The global green investment market has gone from virtually a standing start in 2007 to being worth an estimated £754 billion today, dollars rather today. That's absolutely massive. Now, Scotland's natural endowments mean that we're really well placed to take advantage of that. And I think if we could secure even a small proportion of that investment and use it responsibly in communities, then the results could be utterly transformational for Scotland. But how we do that matters. It really, really matters, because with any opportunity, and particularly a big one like that, comes risk. And as I see it at the moment, the biggest risk comes from this becoming a bit of a free-for-all, where investment maybe piles in quite an unmanaged way, and we fail to secure a long-term legacy for Scotland's people. And I, for one, think that would be a real tragedy. And I'm going to resist the temptation to say anything much or too much here about Scotland's oil, other than I think it's important that we do learn from that historic precedent. But I hope the Land Commission can help us to do that, because I think a big part of the job the Land Commission needs to do over the next couple of years is to try to get ahead of the market, to make sure we don't repeat those mistakes of the past, and to make sure that we do grasp this opportunity, but that we do it in a way that ensures the benefits are equitably shared. Now, I don't pretend to know how we're going to do that yet. I don't have all the answers, but I do have a lot of questions. And what I'd like to use this session to do is to start asking some of those questions and hopefully working out where to look for the answers. Now, the question that's at the top of my mind right now is actually a really fundamental one. It's about who owns the rights to exploit Scotland's carbon sequestration potential. And for the avoidance of doubt, I'm talking here about in a legal sense rather than a moral one. And I think it's really important that we do start a discussion here, because how we answer that question is going to determine the whole trajectory of where we go next. If the starting point is that these rights are just part and parcel of title to land, then I think the conversations we have about who should benefit from those rights are going to be quite limited. They're going to focus on how we regulate the market and how we mitigate any adverse effects it might create. But if the starting point is instead that those rights belong to us all, then I think that starts to open up a much more interesting discussion about how the benefits can be shared and about the kind of governance models we need to put in place to allow that to happen. Now, again, I don't know what the answer to that is yet, but what I do know is that if I go outside later and take a bit of a mad digging fit in my garden and happen to discover a big coal seam sitting there, I don't have any right to extract it. It might be my garden, I might own the garden, but I don't have any right to what's underneath it. So I'm just going to leave that thought hanging there for now. The second big question I have about all of this is, how should the benefits from exploiting those rights be shared? And to my mind, there's two bits to this question, actually. The first is about what we can do to make sure a fair share of the benefits from natural capital investment flow back to the communities that live round about. But the second bit is about how any public benefit should be shared between local communities and society as a whole. And again, I don't know what the answer to that is yet, but I can think of a couple of places where we might start to look for answers. The first is Scotland's experience with renewables, which Magnus has already mentioned. You know, we've already got well-established community benefit mechanisms in renewables, and okay, there are criticisms of that, but I think we need to learn from that experience. So what might a community benefit mechanism from carbon sequestration look like, and how can we make sure it's better than what we might have in place at the moment for renewables? The other place I think we need to look for answers actually is Norway, who seem to have a much better track record than we do of managing natural resource booms. So, you know, what would a sovereign wealth fund based on natural capital look like? and what might the role of things like tax or licensing play in creating one. So like I say, I've got lots of questions, not too many answers just now, but I'm really looking forward to this morning's discussion to find out what the other panelists think and what the audience thinks, because those perspectives are going to be really, really important for informing what comes next.
Thanks, Shona. You have, as ever, put in front of us some really challenging and thought-provoking questions in terms of what rights are we actually talking about, and where might we look to find some good examples of how the benefits that result from those rights might be shared. I'm also never ever going to take you seriously again when you say that you're pleased to be joining a meeting that I'm chairing. So thank you for that. And then finally, we're going to hand over to Jeffrey. So Jeffrey Hatcher is the Managing Director of Indufor North America, an international management consulting firm which is supporting clients advancing the sustainable bioeconomy. So the projects that he leads on include sustainable investments in natural resources with clients including public-private partnerships, impact investors, trade associations, international development agencies, and leading conservation organizations. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Megan, and it's a real honor to be part of this panel. Thank you very much for inviting me. One of my first jobs, and I shared this with Megan, was at the United Nations working to establish the South Sudan Land Commission. And so that commission led to one of the most progressive community land rights laws in all of Africa. And so I am a big fan of land commissions and what they can do. And I think you can see where I'm coming from on this topic of community land rights. I'd like to share 4 points from my perspective, and I'd like to give a little bit more international perspective to the discussion today. The first point is that Scotland is definitely not alone in thinking through these challenges. There are economies all around the world that are thinking through how land ownership and rights to benefit from natural capital are interlinked and part of meeting local development and climate commitments. Almost every jurisdiction around the world is thinking through this question because climate change is impacting natural capital and the users of natural capital, and because natural capital is so fundamentally important today to sequester carbon. But they're also grappling with this question because there's a reckoning happening on environmental injustices, in particular in areas where land ownership is highly concentrated and communities historically have not been able to benefit from natural capital. I'll mention from my perspective, I live just outside Washington, D.C. and in the United States, this is a very important topic right now with Native American communities. But globally, there is an increased prominence of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the climate negotiations and the importance of, for example, free, prior, informed consent, but more importantly now, their own ownership of land in territories that are increasingly recognized internationally. Again, from the climate perspective in the international community, it is becoming increasingly clear that nature-based solutions will fail if they don't incorporate community land rights seriously. The second point I'd like to make is that there are risks, but there are also opportunities in thinking about natural capital and community benefits. And I'd like to share some of what I've learned in the state of Maine in New England. Maine is has one of the most concentrated private forest land ownerships in the United States, where several large families own millions of acres of forest, and where the forests have been managed pretty much for lumber and pulp wood production over the past centuries. Historically, communities have benefited from natural resources through jobs, working at mills, driving trucks, selling paper, but they've also borne many of the downsides from paper production, particularly health issues over the past 50 years or so. And with the decline in pulp and paper markets globally, there have been extremely negative economic livelihood impacts on forest-based communities in Maine, where there's almost no safety net for communities and where towns and their administrative structures depend very heavily on taxes from large industry. So we're now working with them because this is where the opportunity is in diversifying the forest sector, to think about the new products that can be produced from trees, everything from chemicals to fuels to construction materials. And that aligns very nicely with Maine's very ambitious climate agenda, which is thinking through how wood could be used, for example, in mass timber construction, which would generate jobs, would use the resource, but also sequester carbon and meet local demand for housing. The third point is just how important an integrated approach is to thinking through these issues. There are lots of opportunities for creativity because of new environmental markets, but there's also room for caution. And I'd like to use another example from the United States, which is over the past several decades, there's been an increased focus in the US Southeast for wood pellet production. So turning forests and also growing new trees on a barren land to produce pellets for the EU market. The EU is one of the major consumers of wood pellets because of the directives around renewable energy. But there's now a controversy in the EU over wood energy, and that's likely to have a major impact on smallholders and communities in the United States. And it already has had a significant impact on the environment. So I think really thinking through these community benefit mechanisms is fundamentally important. We can think about trust funds and sovereign wealth funds, but jobs and taxes and how a community plans for its future in a resilient way is supremely important today. I'd also like to mention that emerging economies around the tropics are a particularly good source of information to think through community benefit sharing mechanisms. There's been a lot of work done in Brazil, in parts of the Congo Basin, in Indonesia, about how communities can benefit from forest and climate change mitigation programs. The last point, if I'm staying in time, is just how important land rights are now to internationally recognize human rights. Land is, as we know, a cross-cutting issue that directly impacts on the enjoyment of a number of human rights, the rights to culture, the right to an economic livelihood, and there has been increased sensitivity to this and increased understanding of the interconnectedness between land and human rights over the past few decades, where there's been a global land rush in the global south. And there's increasingly a backlash against large-scale corporate land acquisition. But again, companies have modified their approach. There are new outgrower models that are being tested and used that rely on community land ownership, but also integrate communities in the production of commodities. And companies are very sensitive to this issue in order to keep their social license to operate. So I'm just throwing a few ideas on the table. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was really very interesting to hear not only about the work you're doing in your own backyard, can we say, in Maine, but also to share some perspective, having worked on these issues around the world. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to just share a conversation between all five of us. It seems that when we talk about the panel title, Natural Capital, how to deliver benefit sharing, how to share the benefits with communities, that we need to think actually with quite a lot of clarity just about what those terms mean, because we've had a number of suggestions from you all about what kind of benefits we're actually talking about when it comes to things that we should be sharing as a result of this natural resource boom. Shona's very provocative suggestion that's already had a number of responses in the chat about whether or not the rights to sequester CO2 go automatically with the land that's associated with them, or whether there's a broader national national interest in terms of those rights. And then the other difference that Jeremy mentioned in terms of whether or not the benefit sharing mechanism that he's focusing on is focusing simply on sharing the change in land value, or whether there's also a mechanism there for sharing the values which will be generated from the natural capital generation, carbon sequestration, reforestation. And then we had Jeff just mentioned now the importance of thinking not just about the financial benefits which can accrue from these projects, but the need to build broader community resilience in as a way of sharing these benefits. So I'm wondering if the panelists can first just talk a little bit more, reflecting on each other's presentation, on what kind of benefits we're actually talking about here that need to be shared. Who'd like to go first? Maybe we'll go from the bottom upwards. So Jeffrey, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the other presentations capture a lot of the dynamics around this issue, and very happy to have Jeremy on the panel to hear his perspective in terms of an actor that's actually trying to implement this work. I think the financial benefits are obviously very important, particularly when you think about communities where natural capital is one of their sole sources of income, or one of the major resources that they have, and integrating those financial benefits into the public system, into schools and roads and tax collection and planning for the future. But I'd also strongly make the argument that communities benefit from the recreation opportunities they have in nature, the aesthetics in where they live, and the cultural connection they have to a forest or to a landscape. And I think those are, knowing Scotland just a bit, very important to the Scottish culture. And I'll say again, the US Southeast, I think, though it is production forestry to create wood pellets, there are landscapes that have been transformed. And so even if there is theoretically a benefit for the climate from using wood for energy, there's been lots of destruction. And so, thinking through how those production models can really land somewhere and what else you need to make them supportive. And there's also a lot of testing, for example, how to use multi-species plantations rather than just single monoculture plantations. So, there is a balance there, and I think the community is the right starting point. In the US, we have individual land ownership. Communities are represented through towns, but people can make a lot of their own decisions in terms of how land is used. So I would really ground it in the community. And we have examples of community land ownership in the United States, particularly through Native American communities, but it's very insignificant in terms of the total landscape area that's managed for these issues.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Shona, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'll try. And I suppose the most obvious type of benefit is the financial benefit, but and I suppose how you might share that, I think, is a question for some debate. But I suppose the only point I would make is I think we shouldn't necessarily just start from the perspective that all benefits should accrue to the local community. I think we can't lose sight of the kind of national community as well in that. The bit I really want to pick up on, though, I think, was what you might describe as our second round spending effects or supply chain effects. And I was really interested in what Jeremy was talking about, because he mentioned a couple of times in his talk about the local jobs. And I think that, to me, is where we really, we really have the potential to do something quite interesting here for local communities. It's about, I suppose it's about embedding community wealth building principles, isn't it? About making sure where you can that those jobs go to local people, making sure where you can that supplies that are purchased to operate these kind of companies and these kind of operations are bought locally. So it's about embedding those community wealth building principles, I think. And then there's something else for this in me, and this is going to seem like a bit of an abstract point, but maybe it's one, I'm hoping that it's one that maybe Jeremy can pick up on. I suspect that there are also opportunities to create added value benefits, so benefits that add value to the local community without necessarily adding a lot of cost to the land manager. And I'm not quite sure what that might look like, but the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily think about up front. You only sort of identify the opportunity as you're working with local communities. So that kind of added value benefit is something I'm really interested in, but I can't off the top of my head think of an example about what that might look like.
Great, Shona, thank you. So Jeremy, quite a lot of questions and comments aimed at wanting to understand a bit more about what you're actually proposing and doing on the ground. Thanks.
Well, the jobs are as follows. We've got to take as much carbon dioxide down out of the atmosphere as we can into all the different habitats of the land we're lucky enough to own, brackets temporarily have borrowed. I don't think anyone really owns this type of country. So that's the first thing. And then we have to increase the biodiversity. I mean, if we don't do something about biodiversity collapse, we're going to lose our pollinators. We're not going to be able to feed ourselves. I mean, maybe the rich will be able to, but so that's vital. You've got to do those two things hand in hand. You have to make it economic, because unless it can be done economically, people who care about the things that perhaps everyone on this call cares about will not be able to persuade the folk who maybe don't care so much. And yeah, so this is the challenge. Now, it's risky, you know. It's a frontier. We know from the work we've done at Bunloit that we have enormous opportunities to take carbon down out of the atmosphere. We know we have great opportunities to grow biodiversity, even though we're on a pretty biodiverse tract of land. And we know we can employ lots of local people who tend to love their jobs. I mean, talk to any Bunloit ranger, watch the recent webinar they all did for the Ecosystems Knowledge Network and listen to their perspectives on it. But it is a frontier, and I've talked to the government officials who are charged with making all this happen and working out how the land management system will undergo this system change that both Edinburgh and London have promised, essentially, in going forward. How are they going to do it? And they're very frank. Very senior people have said to me, at this point, we have no idea. So, you know, if you go to raise money based on that premise, try and create a business plan that has sensible numbers in it, I guarantee, you know, it will be very difficult to get it past the credit committee of any major financial institution. So you've got to go initially with family offices and high net worth individuals and impact investment organizations who understand these risks and are prepared to take them with you. Now, what I'm hoping we're going to be able to do with the Bunloit project is de-risk that and sort of do such a good job with the science that we can influence the policymakers, have them introduce policies that will benefit, you know, entities like mine, which aren't perfectly positioned for many people, but also communities, making it easier for communities to take lower risk decisions about buying land themselves and operating it this way. That's the hope. And in the interim, with the growth mechanism, with Highland's rewilding idea, how it works is it's not just connected into the price of land, if we can get it set up, but also the profit and loss account of the management of the land, so that local folk have shares in the whole asset base of the entity. And if the land continues to go up, so their share price will continue to go up. And if we're lucky enough to end up making it all profitable sustainably and ethically, they benefit from that too. So that's why I'm hoping it will be a good contribution in the toolbox of how we take these opportunities and get local communities more involved.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. That's really insightful. Magnus, you're next.
I'll maybe start with a couple of interesting examples where the community, or we do see a wider sharing of access, at least to natural capital, and the first of which would be through access rights to responsible access, and the general public being able to access this, the benefits of the environment. The second of which would be restricted to the crofting counties here in the Highlands and Islands, but looking at common grazings and crofting regulation, allowing at least some aspects of the community to access carbon sequestration on landowners and wider land which fall under common grazings. But I'll maybe spend most of my time answering this question on the last aspect, which is how do we ensure that everybody benefits from these resources? And folks that know me will know I spend a lot of time arguing that those communities close to the resource should benefit from that resource, particularly in kind of more remote rural areas, for want of a better term, to avoid seeing capital or cash extracted. But in this sense, I think there's a very nice case to be made for a national wealth fund, a sovereign fund, and making sure that national assets end up with the people who most need them. So I could very much see, for example, the attractiveness of a taxation on carbon, for example, in rural areas in Scotland, helping, say, deprived inner city communities as well on a national front. But I think Shona referred to it there, we need to make sure that this cash, where it ends up, is used for community wealth building exercises. If we look, for example, to renewable energy, community benefit funds, we're perhaps not seeing that there. So yeah, making sure the cash ends up where, if we're looking at financial, making sure the cash ends up in the right places and it's been spent in the right ways.
Great, thank you, Magnus. So building on a number of your points, particularly Jeremy's comment that there are ideas are still being developed, shall we say, in both Holyrood and Westminster in terms of what the policy and regulatory frameworks around this should be. I'd like to ask you all just to say a few words about if you were in charge of developing the policy and regulatory framework, which was going to help to distribute the benefits from this natural capital boom in land, both within local economies and the local community and in terms of the wider national public interest. What would your top policy or regulation be? Magnus, I'm going to go through this one to you.
Unmute myself. You've put me on the spot here. I've not had enough time to think about this. Maybe going back to the original points in my 5 minutes, and that would be trying to drive as much policy and regulation legislation as possible for communities to take ownership of that natural capital itself. And there's many ways of doing that. We've seen some successful ways, and we're seeing increasingly successful ways through Scottish Land Fund, for example. But yeah, I think there's certainly aspects where we need to help resource communities to be able to take these assets on. A lot of communities at the moment, particularly we're having this discussion recently with one community activist who was saying that because of the aging population, there's less people to take the less capability for taking on this. So I would agree, I would suggest that pushing more towards community ownership would be my preferred choice, but I'll say that's quite a utopian view at times, and I'm a realist, and there's maybe there's certainly needing a move to try and shift landowners more towards what Jeremy proposals are sounding like.
Great, thank you. Jeffrey, would you like to go next in terms of your international perspective?
Sure, I'll try. It's a tall order to advise the UK or the Scottish government on what to do, but I think Magnus's point is really important. Community ownership embeds rights for the long term, and you could consider in perpetuity rather than policy decisions that could be fickle or change with the times. And so I think grounding in community land rights is really important. And I'll note, that the UK FCDO is promoting nature-based solutions and really grappling with a lot of advocacy from Indigenous and local communities globally as the UK steers COP26. And so no one has the perfect solution. And I think it depends on the land ownership structure where you are. In a place where, let's say Congo, where the government claims all the forests, you might not want the carbon rights to be associated with the owner of the forest. In a place where communities own more of the land, like potentially in Brazil, you'd like to see more of the carbon rights accrue directly benefit to the community that owns the land. But thinking through what are the creative solutions where you might not see an immediate dissolution of large estates into community hands. Is there a way to integrate communities in? Jeremy's talking about jobs, but more maybe aggressively in managing landscapes. Or devolving some rights to manage beyond the boundaries of an estate. So I think there are ways to do it, and I would just insist on the grounding it in the community land ownership is a more durable solution than intermediate options right now.
Great, thank you. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, just on a very last point before coming back to your question, I think that the experience so far here is that sort of thing begins to happen. It begins to become self-organizing. So our idea of planting a big new forest on the degraded pastures of the Bunloit Estate as a sort of legacy for the climate summit, we call it the Forest of Hope. That went out in a newsletter to the community association, And several landowners along, neighboring landowners along the estate said, hey, can we take part in that as well? And now it's gone still further. There's a local community organization called the Cabrac Trust that exists to bring jobs and livelihoods and homes back to the Cabrac area where we are. And they're organizing a meeting of folk who own land, big and small, up the valley, to try and turn it to a regional corridor. So, you know, that will become a self-organizing thing. If that gets off the ground, it won't be us that are managing it. So that's one thought. Now, on the nature-based solutions, carbon is easier than biodiversity. We have carbon markets, they're imperfect, but there's a high carbon price. That's not too difficult to do. Then you've got the question of who shares the spoils, as it were, the profits, and I'll come back to that. But let's do biodiversity next. That's very difficult to do because, you know, how do you measure biodiversity gain? That's one of the things we hope to really contribute to the science of on the Bunloit project with all our partners in the Scottish Centres of Excellence, University of Highlands and Islands we're working with, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and others. So, you know, collectively, we'll hopefully be able to help officials get to that difficult answer that, you know, we struggle with. I mean, everybody struggles with at the moment, quickly enough to make a difference to the biodiversity collapse. And, you know, the collective knowledge here is going to become very, very important indeed. Now, there's a risk that policymakers, one senior policymaker said to me, one of the things we're worried about as we wonder, you know, what the heck we're going to do about all this is not being radical enough. I've never heard anyone say anything like that in Westminster, but I have up here. And so, yeah, if there are radical policies that come in, there will be an immediate danger of cowboyism, you know, people coming in from outside, the land price driven up even further, and all that. So government, I think, has to have a dual button dial approach. Yes, you do radical changes in land management, you have to, or else the climate's going to melt down and we're not going to be able to feed ourselves. But at the same time, you tax things. As soon as you start seeing things overheating, you slap in tax. And, you know, you really operate with the assumption that we're not going to let anybody make obscene profits or even exceptionally large profits. And if you've got institutions coming in saying, you know, we want IRRs of 20%, you just say, no, you're not going to be allowed to do that. We'll tax that. And that's, I think, where the UK lost so many opportunities in the North Sea with oil, getting the tax right. And it can be a hypothecated tax for getting local communities more involved, or it could be a national tax, as someone on the panel said. That's a choice for others to take. Final thought on taxation is the issue of the rising land price. And I think, I know this is a terribly unpopular view among landowners, but I think there should be a tax on people coming in, buying up Scottish land and selling it on. So, you know, it's ridiculous that someone should be able to sell a decent sized house in a suburb of Surrey, come up to Scotland, borrow a bit of money and, you know, own thousands of acres of Scotland and do what they want on it. It's ridiculous. And if I were a politician, I'd be arguing very hard for a graduated tax so that local purchasing is fine, but if you're coming in from outside, you've got to pay a much higher level of tax. And that would serve, I think, to take some of the heat out of the rising land prices. So I offer that thought as well as a contribution to the mix of challenges and opportunities that we have.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, the tax and land question is one certainly that the Land Commission has been working on for the last couple of years, and we actually have a paper on looking at looking at the options and pros and cons of various different tax and fiscal reforms, which will be coming out before the end of the year. So if anyone is really wanting to know about that, please keep an eye out on that on our website. Now, we have only 10 minutes left of this session, so I am going to move us on to some of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A. Magnus and Jeffrey, there's a question here from Sandra Holmes, which I'd like you both to respond to, which is about whether or not appropriate and meaningful community engagement and benefit should be a condition of any public funding investment in carbon initiatives. Magnus, Jeffrey, any views on this?
Yeah, so Jeff, you want to go first?
Go for it, Magnus.
It's a really interesting question, and I'm even going to pick up on the wording here in terms of community engagement. And I would propose we need to go well beyond community engagement, and the community need to be embedded rather than engaged in any decision making. So whether or not it's communities having specific spaces on boards or on trusts, the community needs to be well more than just engaged. They need to be front, right, left, right, centre of the whole discussion here and the whole decision-making process. And sorry, I've lost the question, but for public funding to be associated with that, absolutely. And I think that also comes back to issues around public interest tests as well.
Great, thanks, Magnus. Jeffrey?
Yeah, just support that. I mean, I mentioned earlier on international human rights law, and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights make it very clear that corporations that invest in land need to engage in free, prior, informed consent and have a very participatory approach to their investments, and that government should support that, and that there's even a stipulation that local populations should benefit from the revenues generated by an investment agreement. So this is, I think, really well supported by the best approaches around the world in terms of land acquisition, and it seems to me like a no-brainer.
Great, thank you. Well, someone's worked on international human rights and land reform. I'm really glad that you suggested the free, prior and informed consent provision. It's something that we need to certainly look at in Scotland. Shona, I have a question for you here from Claire Cooper, which is about the kind of support that's needed from the Scottish Government in terms of the pipeline of policy frameworks which would enable communities to take forward some of the natural capital opportunities. I'm wondering if you have a response to Claire's question.
I was reading the question there, Megan, and I think it's a really good one actually. But I think what occurred to me, I haven't thought about it in this context, but what occurred to me as I read the question was actually you can kind of take that question and apply it to other elements of community development, because I think we do have a bit of an issue in this country with there's a huge appetite amongst a lot of communities to take forward projects and to take a lead on these things, but often a lack of support at the kind of project development stage. And I think in natural capital or anything else, actually, that point stands. So as to which part of Scottish Government infrastructure could take a lead on this, I don't have an answer for you, I'm afraid. I don't know the answer to that. But yes, I think you're quite right to raise the issue. I think it is a bit of a problem.
Great, thank you, Shona. Now, Jeremy, in the Q&A, there's a couple of questions for you, which I'd like you to answer if you can. Although I know that you've also just put up a Q&A on the Highlands on the website, which can answer some of these questions. But the first one is from Annie McGee, and she says, "Please, can you tell us more about how people local to the land in question will remain the primary shareholders to ensure that those with external wealth do not become disproportionately able to sort of control and influence the project?" And then the second one from Mary McLeod is, do you intend to limit your community share ownership scheme to the actual community on the estate, or do you mean the wider Scottish community? And if it's the latter, how, again, do you avoid the local community becoming a minority interest? If you could answer them quite succinctly, that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, I've tried to answer all those at length in the Q&A that's on the website, because they're obvious questions. But in brief, one's going to have to hope that Scots generally pile into this ahead of outsiders, and Highland Scots in particular, and local community Scots in particular. And our outreach is focusing on on that. I don't think you can control it beyond that. And I would be delighted if local investment exceeded outside investment from high net worths and family offices. I very much doubt whether that's possible. So then how do you ensure the local community involvement and ultimate control? That's in the governance. And we will start with a board that is dominated by Highland Scots. And we will have a transition strategy over 10 years, whereby ultimately the whole show will be owned by something called the Highlands Rewilding Trust, which will own all the assets that have been built up and operate them off into the future to the benefit of the communities plural up here, and for keeping carbon out of the atmosphere and biodiversity gained, protected, as it were.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeremy. And again, I would point everyone to have a look at the Q&A on one of Jeremy's websites. Maybe, Jeremy, you could put the link into the chat function so that people can find out easily. One final question, and I'm going to put this to Jeffrey, as who's able to give us a perspective from outside Scotland, is from Richard Williams. Given the urgency of the need for action and the risks and challenges articulated, is there a role for partnership approaches? And are there some examples, particularly Jeffrey, from outside Scotland, that the panel that you could point us to for inspiration?
Yeah, I'll try my best. I'll again mention the state of Maine. I think it has more relevance to Scotland than places in Africa. Our client in Maine is actually a consortium of industry, government, academia, and they have come together to think about how does the forest economy in Maine prosper given all the opportunities that now exist for natural capital beyond just producing wood. And so there's a partnership level at the strategic planning level, but then even at the ground level, there's lots of partnerships between universities and companies that I think are relevant. But you know, when you come to the actual community level, there's plenty of opportunities around the world to learn from partnerships between corporates and communities now, particularly in emerging economies, where companies that have recognized that their land rights link back to kind of unequal land distribution in the past, and they're now devolving some of their estate to communities for outgrower schemes and other ways to manage the land. So partnerships, I think, are extremely important in this. And natural capital is different than many other assets we have. It has an impact on how people live and the quality of life beyond many other assets that we have in our country. So happy to share a lot of resources that exist on partnerships related to this in the chat.
Great, thank you, Jeffrey. So I'm afraid we've only got a couple of minutes left, and this has been such an incredibly interesting panel, and I'm really sad that we don't have more time to carry on these conversations, but I'm really hoping that we will all get a chance to carry on these conversations. Certainly the fact that this issue has been in the headlines all summer in Scotland means that there's a lot of interest in it, and the fact that we've had nearly 200 people join this panel also demonstrates the interest. So I'm just going to wrap up now for the last sort of minute and a half. As expected, this panel's raised more questions than we have answers, but that's really important because I think we need to answer some core fundamental questions in order to set the direction right, in the right direction for this work. And I think that focusing in on what benefits and what rights we're actually talking about sharing, as well as the question of how we're balancing the sharing of those benefits at the local level with the national level and the national public interest. Those are some of the key questions we need to think about. And it's also obvious from this panel that we must not repeat the mistakes of previous booms, and we mustn't try and reinvent the wheel when in fact there is a huge amount of relevant experience across the Atlantic in Maine, but also within the international frameworks and with other countries. And it's really interesting to hear Jeff mention COP26 and the role that the UK government is playing in terms of facilitating conversations around these questions about land rights and tenure rights and governance models around the world, because hopefully we'll find some more answers within the discussions that are taking place in and around Glasgow in November. The conclusion around partnerships has leads, in my view, quite neatly onto a panel that I'm also chairing on Wednesday afternoon as part of this conference, which is focusing on the opportunity for new models of land governance and what we can learn internationally there as well. And this session now is the next session will start at 3:30, and that is looking at what we can do to bring vacant and derelict sites across Scotland back into productive use, which is equally important in terms of responding to the climate challenge and meeting those net zero targets. So before I finish, I just want to remind you, please, as participants, to complete the survey and to provide us some feedback on this session. And finally, my heartfelt thanks to all 4 panelists, Jeremy, Jeffrey, Magnus, and Shona. It's been fantastic to have this conversation with you, and I really appreciate all your contributions and very much hope we can find a way of carrying on the conversation in multiple different ways. Thank you very much, everybody.